Would you like to go back in time to visit the Soviet Union or the famous trial of Yeshoganotsri? The Master and Margarita invites you to follow the devil and company to Moscow. You'll have the unique opportunity to attend a seance of black magic and the Great Bull at Satan's, among other things. P.S. Do not address the demonic cat with a familiar you unless you drank Bruderschaft with him. He's very delicate. The Master and Margarita need no introduction. There are two characters in the title, yet they're more often than not overshadowed by a giant black cat, at least on book covers. There's satire, there are many literary references. It's popular among people of all ages, and it's one of those books that everyone should read. But what makes it so special? Why is the devil so charming? And what does it have to offer besides magic, naked women, and alcohol? Perhaps this video will make you want to read or reread the novel or a few passages. It might remind you of some specific details or simply entertain you. I'm sure that you'll find some valuable things here whether you read the book or not. Just recently, a man who is close to me comforted me by predicting that when I die, in the near future, nobody shall come to me, apart from the black monk. And just think what a coincidence this is. Even before this prediction, the story had got stuck in my head, and it's a little scary after all to think that nobody will come. What is one to do though? This is how my life has unfolded. Every night now, I look not forwards but backwards, because in the future, I see nothing for myself. The only thing I curse now are those 2 fits of unexpected shyness, which flew over me like a fainting fit. I have a justification. That shyness was the fruit of my exhaustion. I had grown tired after years of literary labor. There is a justification, but there is no comfort. Both the protagonists from Chekhov's short story and one of the main characters from The Master and Margarita encounter a supernatural force, and this has a profound impact on their lives. The philosopher from The Black Monk falls ill, then meets the title character who entices him by promising access to some secret knowledge. Can you think of a better temptation for a philosopher? So this man finds out that he's one of the few chosen ones who can go beyond the limits of human knowledge, who can access some higher truth and serve it in this world. He experiences an awakening, and he feels that from now on he has to live in accordance with this higher truth, which doesn't always coincide with conventional reality. By the standards of conventional reality, he goes crazy. The master checks himself into a mental hospital after publishing a part of his novel and being criticized, to put it lightly. Obviously, in those days, people wouldn't just criticize your work and let you live. You'd have to face the consequences. Everyone who's involved in the literary scene, everyone except him, of course, is a hypocrite. It seems ridiculous to him that he can't choose the topic for his own work, that he can't write about something that he's interested in. What's more relevant than his quote-unquote mental illness is the subject of his novel. You see, he used to be a historian and somehow tapped into some secret knowledge. He accessed the Akashic records or something and wrote the truth about Pontius Pilate and Jesus. Just like the main character from Chekhov's story, he isn't really interested in the here and now. He is exceptional. At least this is what we're led to believe. Even his title suggests that. There are quite a few interpretations of his nickname. One of them comes from the dialect of Bulgakov's family, where masters were people who taught grammar using the Bible. When we look at the academic degrees in many countries, we can see that the master is one level below the doctor, but the Doctor in Margarita doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? Anyway, no matter where we look, the title is always attributed to the initiated. You've probably heard of another character who was exceptional, who wanted to go beyond the limits of human knowledge, but more on Dr. Faust later. For now, let's take a closer look at the first 2 chapters of The Master and Margarita. At the hour of the hot spring sunset, 2 citizens appeared at the patriarch's ponds. Not to men, not to gentlemen, but to citizens, because in the Soviet Union, just as in the post-revolutionary France, everyone was a citizen first and foremost, and then a person. By contrast, Voland, who is one of the strangers you shouldn't talk to, is called a man. One of the citizens is Berlioz, the editor and chairman of the board of Masalit, and the other one is the poet Homeless, or Бездомный, depending on your translation. The editor's name might remind you of the famous composer, but according to the poet, the composer just happens to have the same name as Michel Berlioz. One of the most famous works of this composer is Symphonie Fantastique, which is about an artist who suffers from unrequited love and takes opium. At one point, someone loses their head too. In the fifth movement, demons and sorcerers celebrate Sabbath night. It's more fancy and less spooky than I'd imagine, but it isn't bad by any means. Another work of his, The Damnation of Faust, could have been the reason Bulgakov chose this name for his character. You can't help but notice that there are a few parallels between Mikhail Afanasyevich Bulgakov and Mikhail Alexandrovich Berlioz, the most obvious one being their initials. You can't do it by accident, and Bulgakov was one of those people who cared about this sort of things. The previous drafts of the novel are convincing enough. The other similarities come into play later in the text, and the only explanation I could come up with is that Berlioz is an alternative version of Bulgakov. If Bulgakov were to adapt to the new life, if he would have betrayed himself. On this terrible May evening, reference to Gogol, no one was to be seen on the path under the lindens where these two citizens wanted to take a walk. The linden trees could allude to Schubert's song cycle Winter Journey, particularly the fifth song, The Linden Tree. This tree reminds the hero of his past. When he passes it at night, its branches rustle as if calling to him, "Come here, to me, my friend, here you will find rest." Even if we take into account the whole musical theme of the Master and Margarita, it still might seem like a stretch, but if you look at the bigger picture, especially the things that happen in the second half of the novel, you can begin to understand how much work he put into details like this. So Berlioz and Homeless want to drink something to cool down, but the only drink they can get is warm apricot soda. Some translators choose apricot juice. Now that's how you punish your characters. Berlioz feels strange, he even has a hallucination, then he proceeds to lecture Homeless on Jesus and the fact that he didn't exist. You see, in his poem, Homeless made Jesus unlikable, but unwittingly implied that he had actually existed. According to Berlioz, who brings up a few myths as well as historians to support his argument, not only is Christianity untrue, but it's also unoriginal because it stole elements from other traditions. It was an exceptionally hot day. No wonder Berlioz mentions the lesser-known terrible sun god Vistipusli, the blue hummingbird of the left side. Later we see what the sun has to do with the Master and Margarita and their relationship. Apparently, this deity became a stock character, a small demon in Faust puppet plays. In the Grimm's dictionary of the German language, Vistipusli means devil and idiot. It so happens that while Berlioz is talking about his doe statue, the first man appears in the pathway. "Make room, Squire Folland comes." Never speak to strangers, says the title. Yet, the most interesting things can happen when you do. When their free choice is either limited or threatened, most people will desire the forbidden fruit more than before. It's like when you discover that a book was banned or that you can't leave your country, the thing you feel is called reactance. This is why some people avoid using the words must and should and controlling language in general. Freedom of choice is one of the things that come up a lot in the novel. Obviously, there's also the historical aspect. In Soviet Russia, just as in many other places, everything foreign was alluring but suspicious. A lot of work went into convincing people that the USSR was heaven in comparison with other countries, and that most foreigners were spies, or at least not to be trusted. Later in the book, one of the demons fakes this sort of thinking while talking to a citizen. He uses this xenophobia to his advantage. So the citizens are engaged in a conversation about God, and the stranger approaches them. The subject is so interesting that he couldn't resist. "Forgive my impunity, but as I understand, along with everything else, you also do not believe in God?" He made frightened eyes and added, "I swear I won't tell anyone." And then, when Berlioz informs him that the majority of the population doesn't believe in fairy tales about God, he shakes his hand and says, "Allow me to thank you with all my heart. How lovely and unexpected." But then a problem arises. If there's no God, then who controls life? Unlike the majority of the population, the stranger believes that to govern, one would need a plan for at least 1,000 years. Since man is mortal and, what's even worse, unexpectedly mortal, then how could he govern himself? In short, he thinks that no brick can fall out of the blue. He tries to convince these atheists that both the devil and Jesus exist, but that they are different from their portrayal in religious texts. I gotta say, his method seems to be more effective than Kant's. Then he makes a prediction, which everyone who's read the book remembers, and everyone who hasn't will have fun discovering. He says something about Mercury in second house, which is apparently related to finance. The person who's affected by this prophecy cares a lot about material goods and surrounds himself with people with similar values. He sacrificed art to maintain his comfortable position. So this foreigner is a historian, a specialist in black magic, or just a madman. After reading one version of this scene to a select group of people, Bulgakov asked them who is Voland. The audience members wrote their answers on slips of paper and exchanged them. Surprise, everyone wrote the same answer. It was none of the above. One of the most recognizable motives of this novel is the Faustian Bargain. How would a writer go about this? By keeping the core of the pact intact, they'd have the freedom to play with the rest of the elements as they wish, to make them as unique as they can. If you read more than one story that has this motive, you might have noticed certain patterns. In most of them, there's a demon who's interested in buying a human soul, and there's a mortal who wants to sell his soul, his most valuable possession, in exchange for something he craves. There's obviously the honeymoon period, otherwise it wouldn't be called a Faustian bargain or a bargain of the fortunate. The circumstances of the pact, the desired outcome, the appearance and personality of the devil vary from one story to another. They can spice things up. If you haven't read the novel but heard a thing or two about it, you might assume that either the Master or Margarita or both made the deal with the devil and that's the main thing. But in the first few chapters, you will discover that people are eager to make all sorts of pacts, especially when they don't understand what they're getting themselves into. Another interesting twist is that most of the characters who made the deal and got what they wanted without too much effort had done it before the main action started, the most cool part, I mean. I think that both Mephisto and Voland come to their humans when they're trying to rewrite the Bible. It's the only way I can explain certain parts of the Master's backstory, as well as the reason manuscripts don't burn became the most famous line in the novel. During the Walpurgis night, Mephistopheles is introduced as Junker Voland. Then why does Bulgakov insist on making it clear that Voland from the Master and Margarita is written with a W or a double V? Because of aesthetics, of course. You see, the Master gave up his Christian name and therefore his formal connection to his guardian angel, and he has a cap with an M written on it. What's the upside down of M? Thus, Bulgakov kept the link with Mephistopheles and created a new one with the Master. Voland's appearance at the Patriarch's Ponds, the former goat swamp by the way, is accompanied by the devil knows how many devilish phrases. It's almost like he's been summoned. The fact that his cane has the head of a poodle doesn't help either. Just when you decide to throw everything to the devil and go to Kislovodsk, and speak of the devil, a strange citizen will be swaying before you when you least expect it. And then some foreigner will be trying to convince you that God isn't dead and we haven't killed him. As a rule, the devil helps the mortal renounce God and fight the good in his soul, and then punishes him for doing that. Voland and his retinue are all part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good, unironically. They punish people more than they tempt them. This may be caused by the fact that, at this point, they need no temptation to follow the first shiny thing they see. In the book, the forces of evil don't fight the good in people, but simply expose the flaws of the so-called respectable citizens who are already in their control basically. They are ruthless when it comes to crooks, bureaucrats, and hypocrites. In this case, choosing the lesser of the two evils means choosing the devil. Maybe at times the punishment doesn't fit the crime, and they don't try to catch the big fish. They have far more important issues to solve than Kremlin, for instance. The book would have been very different if they had time to avenge more significant things. Funnily enough, this reminds me of the epigraph to Anna Karenina, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." Unlike in Tolstoy's novel, though, the judges in The Master and Margarita are more straightforward, and we as readers are unwittingly on their side. Unlike in Anna Karenina, here there's no nuance to the culprits. They're either faceless or dislikable. At least Voland and company seem more just than the institutions that made people disappear in real life. The members of a certain Moscow institution are never presented as individuals, but rather as functions. When it comes to them, Bulgakov tends to use phrases like "it was said," or "the voice on the telephone had said very briefly where it was from." There are so many images that stay with you forever. Most people remember details from every single scene because they're so striking. For instance, and this isn't the best one, at a huge writing desk with a massive inkstand, an empty suit set, and with a dry pen, not dipped in ink, traced on a piece of paper. The suit was wearing a necktie, a fountain pen stuck from its pocket, but above the collar there was neither neck nor head, just as there were no hands sticking out of the sleeves. The suit was immersed in work and completely ignored the turmoil that reigned around it. To some extent, this was his revenge novel. Bulgakov could have chosen to adapt, to write more things that the critics would approve, but that would have made him a dead writer. And the Soviet critics had enough corpses to eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So he said, "Fight fire with fire." How do you fight a darkened state? You bring a darker, more powerful force that can't be reached by mere humans. A force that can expose and punish every graphomaniac, rogue, and coward. You laugh at the face of fear and say, ridiculous. I have to warn you that most of the criticism that tries to view The Master and Margarita as a novel with a key, which can be decoded, which contains references to actual personalities and events, are not only useless, but extremely dull. Parallels are fine, but everything in moderation, right? My favorite one is the preposterous theory that Bulgakov wrote this for Stalin. No artist with a healthy dose of self-respect would dedicate so much time and energy and hope that some political leader would read their work and follow their advice. Although there was one particular telephone conversation between them, when Stalin asked him, "It is perhaps true that you have asked to leave the country? What is it? Are you really so sick of us? You're damned if you say yes, you're damned if you say no." So Bulgakov replied, "A writer cannot live outside his country." This fit of unexpected shyness shouldn't have been so unexpected for him, considering the risk. As Voland will say much later in the novel, never ask for anything, never for anything, and especially from those who are stronger than you. They'll make the offer themselves and give everything themselves. This is so well put, especially if you're at the gates of hell. Abandon all hope, you who enter here. Don't express your wishes or your needs, and everything will be offered to you on a plate, right? This is the perfect way to instill the victim mentality into people. All your efforts to change things will fail, so why bother? You can't control the bricks, can you? Voland and his retinue do a lot of things, and their adventures can be quite entertaining. But I think that what makes them exciting aren't the events themselves, but rather the flamboyant cast. Let's take a closer look at them. Voland. Stranger, historian, philosopher, magician, madman. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. I've been around for a long, long year, so many a man's soul and faith. The devils are the most well-written characters. Most of the time they're more humane than mortals, and Voland, being their boss, is the best written one of all, although he remains quite mysterious. The only intimate details we know about him is that he has what looks like rheumatism, that his granny left him some herbs, and that he was, at least once, intimate with a witch, so typical devil. Most of the time, Voland's Russian is flawless, which is very surprising. Other times he has an accent. He is only perhaps German, nothing about him is definite. From the beginning we see that his appearance depends on the observer. Like any respectable devil, he is multifaceted, but there is one constant element, asymmetry, which is characteristic of his evil nature. You can notice this in his entourage as well. For instance, Korovyev's pince-nez. Before giving the citizens his card and introducing himself as a historian, the editor and the poet were more suspicious about Voland, but he manages to gain their respect when they find out he's a scholar, a specialist. Their language changes too. His visit has different explanations depending on the listener. He tells Berlioz and Homeless that he had been invited to Moscow to study the medieval manuscripts of Gerbert of Aurillac. Really short tangent here. This man became Pope Sylvester II, and he was interested in white magic. He used to teach quadrivium, he was a scholar and a scientist. There were rumors that he stole a book of spells from an Arab philosopher and that he practiced black magic and made a pact with the devil. He rose in rank quite fast and he was very intelligent, so people were naturally suspicious. There was another legend that said he had some sort of head which could answer yes or no questions. Later, Voland says that he came for a seance of black magic, later that he wanted to observe people, then that he came for the annual ball or for the novel. I think it's clear that Voland has to restore the master's novel. Maybe the other reasons he gives are just as legitimate, but this seems to be the one that makes him indispensable. Why would the devil come to Moscow? Doesn't he have better things to do? You will discover the answer to these questions in the novel itself. The magician, choir master, sorcerer, interpreter, devil knows what he really is. Koroviev, in short. He is Bulgakov's version of Ivan's devil from The Brothers Karamazov, or Petrusha Verkhovensky from Demons. He is very bold, chatty, and expressive. Just like Mephistopheles, he is a joker and an illusionist. Besides the ability to create things out of thin air, he knows the past and the future, and he can heal others. He seems to fit in with any group of people. He can be formal and respectful in Voland's presence, and he can use slang with the citizens. There's no contradiction between his role as a knight and his role as a fool. One of his funniest roles is that of an interpreter, because he himself uses so many foreign words when there's no need to. He wears different masks throughout the novel, so he's one of the most fun characters to follow. If the devil or one of his versions is embodied by Voland, Koroviev is more like a petty demon, tall and emaciated and wearing a checked jacket, jockey cap and a pince-nez. Well, in short, you know who. Koroviev was you-know-who before it became mainstream. His clothes could allude to the figure of the Harlequin, who has some trickster qualities. He's not your typical trickster though. He and his co-star Begemot never punish the innocent, and they're never more cruel than the culprits. His name could have been inspired from the village of Stepanchkova, and his second name, Fagot or bassoon in translation, was given to him in part because of his body shape, but also because of some French expressions which contain this word. Begemot or behemoth, the most angelical black cat of uncanny size, with a glass of vodka in one paw and a pickled mushroom in another. His biggest flaw is gluttony. His specialty is shape-shifting, not misbehaving, not bothering anybody, just repairing his premise. You'll discover his other talents in the novel. His name isn't just a reference to the beast from the Bible and the Russian word for hippo, but yet another reference to Faust. Remember the poodle on Voland's cane? Well, at one point, Mephistopheles turns into a hippo too, namely when Faust is trying to translate the Bible. Begemot and his partner in crime, Koroviev, both laugh at the new values of their environment, but can adjust their speech and behavior to it. Yes, you heard that right, the cat can speak, but he doesn't just walk on his hind legs and speak. He can also turn into a man, and I never tried to count, but I believe that most of the aphorisms in the book belong to him. Although I think he's one of the most charming characters, he gets away with way more things than the rest of the group. If his presence were a figure of speech, it would be a hyperbole. No one is more animated than him, and this is one of the reasons he's a fan favorite besides his cat privilege. The last character I want to tell you about is Azazel, the gloomiest demon with flaming red head and a fang sticking out of his mouth. Unlike Begemot and Koroviev, he is more familiar with people. His language isn't as refined, but he does all the dirty work. His name comes from the fallen angel who's associated with the sacrifice of the scapegoat and who taught people to make weapons and cosmetics. His specialty in the novel is ultra-violence. I'm kidding, it's just regular violence, but his main function becomes clear in the second half of the book. Now let's go back to the plot. At first glance, this is a book about a mysterious stranger who intrudes into reality and exposes its flaws. But then it does a 180 and talks about the last days of Yeshua Ganotri. The beginning of the novel gives you such a distinct atmosphere that you almost can't believe that the writer could risk it by starting another story in the next chapter. Here, the goal wasn't to satirize Moscow, but rather to recreate certain historical events. So the style had to be different. Unlike all the lies you read in the Gospels, unlike Matthew Levi's fiction, this story is true, honest to Satan. Everything in the novel confirms this fact. Thanks to his genius, the master guessed these events, and we already know that Voland was present there, and he's obviously a credible source, right? I'm not going to talk about this chapter too much. You will compare it to another bestseller anyway. I just want to share the things that won't reveal even a fraction of what you can find in there. Unless you've heard a lot of things about the transitions between the Moscow chapters and the Pontius Pilate ones, you'll probably be surprised by chapter 2, where Voland recounts the events that happened on the 14th day of the spring month of Nisan. This happens to coincide with the master's novel, by the way. We are told that the master wrote this thing about Pontius Pilate, that he's supposed to be the main character, but every time he appears, you can't help but focus on another character. Yeshua's portrayal in the master's work is very different from his prototype, you know. Last year, when I read Tolstoy's interpretation of the Bible, I was surprised to find so many similarities between his version and the master's or Voland's. His book, What I Believe, removes all the metaphysical elements from the New Testament and keeps only the rules. All authority is violence over people, the churches, which are supposed to follow Christ's teaching, go against them, etc., etc. Like Matthew Levite, who follows Yeshua and writes everything, except Yeshua didn't say any of the things written on that parchment, and he begged him to burn it, but manuscripts don't burn, I guess. So not only is everything written in the Bible false, but also everything written by Yeshua's only disciple in the master's novel. What sort of secret library did he go to? Before Bulgakov, many artists and writers tried to portray Christ as a man rather than a god. So clearly the master's novel springs from this tradition. The religious people who are offended by the Master and Margarita aren't offended by Voland, but rather by Yeshua. When Pilate asks him what is truth, he says, "The truth is, first of all, that your head aches, and aches so badly that you're having faint-hearted thoughts of death. You're not only unable to speak to me, but it is even hard for you to look at me, and I'm now your unwilling torturer, which upsets me." This is certainly different from the other truths you might have heard. Yeshua is a positively beautiful man, but there is at least one similarity between him and Voland, namely the idea that no mortal being can have power over life. When Pontius Pilate tells Yeshua that he could cut the thread of his life, He says, "Don't you agree that that thread can only be cut by the one who hung it?" Remember what Volin said about control? Imagine that a man who not so long ago supposed that he was in control of something ends up lying stiff in a wooden box. And those present, realizing that he's no longer good for anything, cremate him in an oven. Then would you really say that that's an example of his control over himself? Since Pilate is controlled by his body, this is the only truth available to him. The only truth he cares about is the truth of his physical state. Only when he cures his headache, Yeshua can tell him a different truth. The trouble is that you are too closed off and have definitively lost faith in people. At times, I remember being glad that I could take a big breath after all the chaos in the Moscow chapters, and I was glad to escape the Soviet Union, but only to find myself in a version of one of the most tragic stories ever. To some of you, this may sound obvious, but I think it's important to say that the novel was published in the Soviet Union in the 60s, meaning that for some of its readers, the Yeshalayim chapters were their first interaction with the Bible. It's kind of crazy to think that the Gospel according to the devil was their introduction to it. Now that we talked about the first two chapters and we talked about the characters more or less, we can discuss intertextuality. When I read the novel for the first time, I was an unseasoned reader, even more so than now, believe it or not. I had a couple of books I adored, but for the most part, I was more interested in real life, and music was my preferred form of art. The first few chapters of the Master and Margarita were so flawless that I couldn't resist. It contains allusions to so many works, allusions that at the time I couldn't comprehend. But as I mentioned before, there are a few memorable details in every scene of the novel, so you can get the reference even years afterwards. It makes sense that in most places they encourage students to read chronologically, or thematically at least, but when you read for pleasure, it doesn't really work like that. So I read The Master and Margarita before I got to most of its sources. It has been fermenting in my mind for years, and its richness doesn't cease to amaze me. First of all, the literary society meets at Gülbadamovan's, and the woman at the door has the same name as the heroine from Gülbadamovan's Woe from Wit. You can see a few parallels between the scene at Gülbadamovan's and the play, namely the part when the character who's telling the truth is considered insane, not to mention the fact that Gülbadamova means mushroom eater, quite a fitting name for a place where people are more concerned with feeding their bodies rather than their souls. What people call fantastic realism in Dostoevsky can be seen in Bulgakov's works too. Although his second wife told him that he was no Dostoevsky, which made him turn pale, his admiration for him is obvious. One of the pseudonyms he used for his early works was Makar Devushkin, one of the main characters in Dostoevsky's Poor Folk. You have no idea how I felt when I was reading certain parts of The Brothers Karamazov, or when I was reading The Adolescent and found this paragraph, how some itinerant charlatan had supposedly cut people's heads off before the whole public, so that the blood flowed and everyone could see it, and then put them back onto their necks and they supposedly grew on again, also before the whole public. Not to say that this is unheard of, but there are too many similarities to think that it's a coincidence. Or when one of the main characters in The Master and Margarita realizes that their idea of harmony isn't worth the tears of a child. This might be another reference to the Brothers Karamazov. There are also quite a few allusions to Gogol, the funny, the mystical, and the bizarre, who was Bulgakov's favorite writer. Dead Souls, The Government Inspector, The Portrait, The Diary of a Madman, and many other short stories have all contributed to The Master and Margarita, both when it comes to its content and its form. It makes sense that Bulgakov's tombstone used to be Gogol's, considering how much he learned from him. So if you want to read The Master and Margarita, let's say in English, which translation should you choose? I only read a couple of paragraphs or pages from each translation, so this is by no means a final verdict. Bulgakov's text has quite a lot of Sovietisms and other isms, and I'm not sure if it would be better to leave them as they are and explain them in the footnotes, or to try to find an English equivalent. At the time, acronyms and contractions gained popularity, so even translating the name of the literary union Masalit can be tricky. So here are the best translations I've seen. Despite a few awkward phrases, Bergen and O'Connor seems to be quite faithful to the original, though Applin's has its good moments as well. PNV's translation can be clumsy at times, and I say this despite all my appreciation for their translation of Anna Karenina. According to some people, their method isn't the best one, but they get decent results most of the time. Some translators choose to leave the character names as they are, others choose an English equivalent, but the curious part is that they don't apply the same rule, the same method to all the characters for some reason. If you really enjoyed the translation you read, no matter the language, you could post the name in the comments. I think that other readers would appreciate it. The Master and Margarita is a novel that gets weird very fast, so if you're not on board from the get-go, there's little chance you'll get on board later. I've come across very few people who are fairly neutral about it. Because of different circumstances, including Bulgakov's health problems and death, the novel resembles a short story collection at times. It almost feels unfinished. Some interesting concepts don't go anywhere. There are hundreds of missed opportunities that could make writers with less fertile imagination cry. This fragmentation also makes this special, and for a book that's so chaotic, there are quite a lot of perfect scenes, including the ending. You can look at one of its aspects and it's colorful and interesting, and your interpretation seems to be right. But then you change the angle just a little bit and it's a whole different story with just as many colors and shapes. It's like a kaleidoscope. There are so many beautiful interpretations that it can be slightly intimidating to try to discuss it in a somewhat short video. You can't capture all its beauty and complexity. I couldn't talk about Margarita or the ball or the scene at the Variety Theater or my favorite Descartes joke ever, but you still have the invitation, right? Thank you for watching this video till the end and for sharing your opinions in the comments. I'm going to disappear now, but I promise I'll come back in the next video. Bye! There's obviously the funny moon. Funny moon.